Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. So these are my learning objectives, which you have, my clinical actions, which you also have. So I'm here to speak today with you about the product Roundup, which, as you know, is extremely popular these days in a more notorious way, but it's also been popular in the field of agriculture for many decades. And the reason is, as is clearly shown on the label here, it's very, very good and effective at killing weeds and grass. How does it do it? Well, it does it by this chemical. This is the active weed-killing chemical in Roundup. It's called glyphosate. Glyphosate is widely used because of the creation, initially, of this genetically modified crop, a corn crop created by Monsanto called the NK603. And it was genetically engineered specifically to withstand the weed-killing effects of Roundup, of glyphosate. So if we were to spray Roundup on this corn crop, what would happen? Nothing. It would keep growing. But all the weeds on the field would die, and that's why it's been used so widely. If we used Roundup on this non-GM corn crop, it would die very quickly, as would all the grass that's been growing in the field. Genetically modified crops, as you can see from this graph, have been increasingly used in the United States over the last several decades. You can see up through 2018, easily over 3/4 of all the crops of corn, of soy, and even cotton are genetically modified. What this means is the amount of Roundup that's been sprayed on all these crops has increased significantly over the decades. Millions and millions of acres in the United States and, of course, around the world. How does glyphosate kill weeds? And this image here reminds me, Joe, you were just speaking about many of these toxins. They disrupt enzymatic pathways, and that's exactly how glyphosate kills weeds. It interrupts what's called the shikimate pathway, which is crucial for the plant in generating several amino acids, including tryptophan and tyramine and phenylalanine. And without these amino acids, the plants die very quickly. You'll also notice I have here that it's a crucial pathway in certain microorganisms. And these are microorganisms in our gut, which I'll be speaking about a little bit later as far as how glyphosate is specifically toxic to our cells. How much glyphosate has been sprayed around the United States? And this will have implications when I share with you our own exposure and how that happens. Well, to date, within the United States, and this is a conservative estimate, about 2.3 million tons of Roundup within the U.S., worldwide over 10 million tons. And repeatedly, it's known this is easily the most widely used herbicide in the world. And of course, this has been a disappointment for a variety of reasons. And one of the disappointments is noted in this article, which interviewed a former EPA senior scientist, Dr. Ramon. And the early promise of introducing genetically modified crops was that it would lead to a reduction in the use of herbicides, such as Roundup. But in fact, it's been just the opposite. Over the last couple of decades, we've had at least a 12 to 20-fold increase in the use of these products. One of the implications of this and consequences, in addition to adverse health for us, which I'll be reviewing with you, but it's also led to the creation of superweeds, over 60 million acres within the United States. So this slide here shows you the distribution of these various so-called superweeds. The problem is, and of course we would expect this, wouldn't we? Nature is brilliant and adaptive, and these plants have figured out ways to keep growing despite being exposed to Roundup. But one of the consequences of this, the farmers, as the years have progressed, have had to use increasingly more and more and more Roundup on the same, say, corn crop or soybean crop that they would have used. And that has led to increased exposure for us. Speaking of our exposure, how do we get it? There are numerous studies on this, but essentially, if you were to eat a corn crop or a soybean crop that was genetically engineered and had been sprayed with Roundup by the farmer to control the weeds, you will ingest the glyphosate that was sprayed on that crop. The same holds for corn. You can see on this next image, and also soy products and honey, amongst others. If we were to study cows that had been fed a conventional diet, which means genetically modified crops essentially, versus more organic, you can see on this image on the left here that they have excretion of glyphosate in their urine that's very, very high levels compared to a cow that has been raised more on an organic diet. And if you were to consume a cow or any of these industrial animals that have been raised on or genetically modified crops, they have lots of glyphosate throughout the organs, including the muscles, which are typically eaten. And this holds true for pigs and also chickens, etc. So some of you might be thinking, well, Paul, I'm aware of that. I knew that genetically modified crops are sprayed with Roundup, and therefore I avoid genetically modified crops, and therefore I'm avoiding glyphosate. Unfortunately, that's not the case. If you didn't know, glyphosate is also sprayed widely on the vast majority of wheat grown in the United States, and also oats grown in the United States, and legumes. Why is that? Is wheat genetically modified to resist the weed-killing effects? No, it's not. So when the farmer sprays the wheat, it kills the wheat very quickly over a period of a day or so. And the farmers do this. They use it as what's called a desiccant to kill the wheat plant, to dry it quickly, and it makes it easier for them to harvest. That's why it's done. So it's done with wheat, also oats. Oats is not genetically modified, so it's sprayed with Roundup. It kills it quickly, and they harvest it. And as I said, also legumes. What are consequences of this for us? Well, some groups have gone out and taken wheat cereals, for example, and corn cereals off the shelf, and look at what we find here. So for example, Cheerios has very high levels of glyphosate, and AMPA, which is the main metabolite of glyphosate. Also Wheaties and on, and I could go through many, many products. From this kind of research and others, it's clear that our main exposure to glyphosate is not by eating genetically modified corn and soy, but it's actually through wheat and oats and legumes. And some humor for you, so some folks have recommended we change the nutrition panel for a lot of products because there's been so much glyphosate found in, for example, Cheerios. It's interesting, and I don't know the exact reason for this, but oats retain much more of the glyphosate than the wheat products do. So when you eat oat cereals, such as breakfast cereals, you can see the very high levels also from this particular study, up to 2,800 parts per billion. Okay, you might have been thinking, well, I've been aware of that too, and therefore I've been avoiding these products, and I eat very healthy and natural. And is this protecting you from glyphosate? Well, I'm sorry to say, the answer is no, also for this. So Nature Valley, these have been, granola bars has been around for many years, and they had been promoting that they're very natural products, but they have just gone through a lawsuit a couple of years ago because there was so much glyphosate found in their granola bars. And that's because of all the wheat that was going into the granola bars. And I'm going to show you a series of slides that other companies, Bob's Red Mill Oats, have gone through similar lawsuits because there was so much glyphosate within their products. California got into the act, and we sued Quaker Oats for the same phenomenon. Kashi's been branded as a natural cereal for many, many years, and they too, unfortunately, were found to have lots of glyphosate in their products. Can I back up on this? Yeah. I wanted to show you this round. You can't see it. It's not a great photo, but this says non-GMO. Many people believe that, this is a non-GMO product, therefore it's safe to eat and I'm good to go. But there's a vast distinction between if it's GMO, yes or no. That does not necessarily mean it's organic. So many companies have gone ahead and they've put the non-GMO in the product, even though they know it's not organic, to help you, motivate you to buy it. But the fact is, it's still not good. So look for the organic label as well. Those of you who like to go to Panera and enjoy their sandwiches, unfortunately, there's a lot of glyphosate in their wheat products. They have not switched over to organic wheat. Ben & Jerry's, you might have seen in this news. This has been over the last couple of years, too. Naked Juices, their build is very natural, and they've also been going through some lawsuits, too. And many of these companies, as a result, they've had to change their labels and take natural and healthy off their labels. Orange juice. why would orange juice have a lot of glyphosate in it? It's not a genetically modified product. But all the orange juices sold within the US that have been tested all have fairly high levels of glyphosate. Why is that? Well, Health Research Institute, which is a lab I've been collaborating with for our studies at UC San Diego, I'll share with you, to run our glyphosate assays, has the answer, because the weeds in the fields around these trees are sprayed with glyphosate. And when the weeds die, the glyphosate is released into the soil, and some of it is taken up into the plants. It's not enough to kill the tree, but it is absorbed into the fruits, unfortunately. And this is an interesting area because historically, when glyphosate was first introduced in the market from industry, the statements were that it was a very unstable in the sense that it would degrade rapidly within the environment, including in the soil. But the fact is it persists in the soil for many, many, many years, as well as elsewhere in the water, et cetera. Pet owners here, some sad news to share with you. There have been some studies. This was published in Environmental Pollution, and every single major brand of pet food has very high levels of glyphosate, higher than we typically see in the human food. And there have been some studies now starting to link this with some of the illnesses we see in pets these days. So there's an interesting consequence of this, and partly a lot of the major food suppliers who have been getting sued, they got together and they've petitioned the EPA to make it illegal for farmers to be spraying the wheat and the oats and the legumes, because it's hard for them to get organic wheat anymore to put in their products so they can go back to the natural branding. And this was a year ago, this article, and I just checked it yesterday, and there's still no outcome from this lawsuit, so I don't know what's happening. So I'm presuming that the rate of high exposure is still there. If you go online, there's some other interesting studies. This was a photograph somebody posted, and someone in their tree, they stuck, they put on this tree a conventional ear of corn and a genetically modified ear of corn, and just watch what the squirrels did. And the squirrels had a strong tendency to avoid the genetically modified corn. There's an instinct there that we often lack, unfortunately. So what about organic foods? Those of you who know all of what I'm saying already, and you've just gone to the organic food market only, and unfortunately, there's actually a fair amount of glyphosate found in organic foods as well. Eggs and dairy, but this particular study here, you can see. All the wines that have been tested in California, including organic wines, have degrees. The levels are lower. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. The levels are lower in the organic wines, but still there. Why is that the case? Why is it that even in organic foods, organic wines, there's still glyphosate? Well, one of the reasons is that glyphosate is essentially ubiquitous. This was a study by the US Geological Survey, and they went through 38 different states in the US and assayed lots of sources of water. And glyphosate was ubiquitous within all these water supplies. And of course, so the crops, those are being watered by wells, for example, for farms, are getting it that way. And this is more of a summary slide. So glyphosate exposure is ubiquitous in terms of crops and various kinds of foods and water. The only way to get it out of water is through using reverse osmosis. So with this as a background, I started becoming aware of this information a couple of years ago, and working at a university where we have a fairly strong epidemiological program, I went to PubMed, which many of you are familiar with. I saw some of you actually were looking through the PubMed earlier during the prior talk, looking up some of your research. And so I went to PubMed to find some epidemiological studies on glyphosate, just to show me how much has our exposure changed over the last few years. And I was surprised to find there was no studies. Despite the US population being increasingly exposed to these products over the decades, there was no research on it. So we set about to conduct this first study, which we did. And this is a graph just of the amount of glyphosate research going back since 1975 up to this year. And you can see incremental increases. And as I review this research, broadly, most of these studies are showing the adverse effects of these products on a host of systems. So what study did we do at the University of California, San Diego? Those of you who aren't familiar with UCSD, I wanted you to know that it's been ranked number 2 by Nature Index for research amongst all public universities in the United States, 4th in the world. Number 1 is the University of California at Berkeley. And I tell you this because we've been using this, trying to leverage this research capacity at UCSD to advance broadly our work in integrative medicine and integrative health, but also focused in on this area too about environmental toxicology and its relevance to human health. So when we went through the literature and realized there's no epidemiologic studies, and we wanted to generate one, the question is how to do it. One way would be to start a new prospective study and raise several $1 million and follow people over a period of decades to see how the exposure changes. That would be tough to do. But we had another idea. So I knocked on the door of Dr. Elizabeth Barrett-Connor, who is an epidemiologist at UCSD, and one of those kind of stratospheric researchers. She's published over 1,000 scientific studies in her lifetime, which is really a lot, those of you who aren't in academia. I'm sad to say she actually passed away a few months ago. She was a friend and colleague. So she had founded the Ranso-Bernardo study of healthy aging a couple of decades ago. And I knew that she had a supply of urine samples and blood samples in her freezers. So I knocked on her door and I said, Elizabeth, what do you know about Roundup? And she said, I don't know anything about Roundup. How about glyphosate? Nothing. So we got into a conversation. I started sharing with her some of the animal literature showing toxicology. And I said, what's missing is some epidemiologic studies showing how exposure has changed over time. And I said, can I have access to your urine samples in your freezer? And she said, yes, of course. And so we went to her freezer, and the first study we did, we just randomly pulled out samples from 100 of the participants in her longitudinal study. So these are people that she had been studying sequentially over the last 25 to 30 years, getting repeated urine samples, getting repeated blood samples. So we randomly selected 100 of these subjects, and we took their 5 urine samples that they had collected over the past approximately 25 years. And as part of this, we created at UCSD what we call the Herbicide Awareness and Research Project, or HARP. And we ran the assays on these samples, and we published it in the journal JAMA. This was in 2017. Excretion of the herbicide glyphosate in older adults between 1993 and 2016. What did we find? Well, we found what you would expect that we would find based on what I'd shared with you so far. So these are the samples. On the lower left, you can see, for example, 1993 to 1996. So in these 100 participants in the study, the first batch of urine samples were collected between 93 and 96. So people would come in sequentially right over the years, because ultimately there are several thousand people in this study. And then those same 100 people, we took samples all the way up to 2014, 2016. And you can see clearly over those 24 years, the amount of glyphosate and AMPA that was being excreted in the urine is increasingly higher, which makes sense given that earlier slide I showed you of the increasing usage of genetically modified crops and therefore Roundup within the United States. As far as the specific levels of glyphosate, and this is in micrograms per liter, you can see also the levels that these subjects have been exposed to increasingly higher through this 25-year period. And the same for the primary metabolite AMPA. So this isn't surprising, but it was needed to be done in the literature. And I was pleased to say that this got a lot of news attention. It stayed in the top 1% of all research news within the US for over 6 months, and we had coverage from around the world. Some of the feedback we got included from Monsanto Corporation. And there was a letter sent to the editor at JAMA, and the group complained about our research study, and they cited several weaknesses. One of them was the research assay we used to determine the glyphosate and the AMP levels. So we wrote a letter of reply, And one of our replies was, well, the assay we used was actually developed by a team of scientists at Monsanto, and we followed their exact protocol. Shortly thereafter, I heard from the UCSD attorney that I've had a request for all of my emails at UCSD that have anything to do with glyphosate, and this was coming in through what's called the California Public Records Act. And those of you who might work in this general neighborhood of nutrition, et cetera, this is a common tactic for industry. They'll go in and they'll want to get as much public record information as they can from you to go through them, and ultimately, hopefully, to find something to disparage you or your research team. So this is one of the consequences of doing this kind of work, which is fine. So what's the big question here of what I showed you so far? The big question of this, does any of this exposure matter? We have increasingly amounts. Dr. Dispenza just shared with us that at least on these other domains, the lead, cadmium, and so forth, exposure matters very, very much. What about glyphosate? It's legal, but is it safe for us to have this exposure over time? Well, it depends who you ask. This is a paper published in Frontiers for Public Health by Michael Antonio. He's a scientist at King's College in London. And it's a great article, and I just want to show you two primary conclusions as far as it depends who you ask. So for example, if you ask individuals from industry, and these are publications by people who are either consultants or directly of industry, essentially, as you would expect, the conclusions are that glyphosate is very safe, even at very low levels of exposure. However, if you ask academia and individuals who have conducted research on these products who are independent of industry, and if you look through the PubMed and all these papers, it's a very different conclusion. And the conclusion is that they're toxic effects, and even at low levels below what we're typically allowed to be exposed to by the legal limits set by the EPA. As many of you might know, the World Health Organization, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, declared in 2015 glyphosate's a probable human carcinogen. In 2017, the year that our paper appeared, that I just shared with you data, California also listed it as an agent known to cause cancer in the US. How do those conclusions compare to the EPA? Well, the EPA says that the scientists have performed a lot of independent evaluation on the data for glyphosate and found essentially there's no risk to human health. Children are not more sensitive. There's no evidence that glyphosate causes cancer. How can we have such different conclusions from several groups in one category and other groups in another? Well, again, this paper gives us insight, this data. So this slide on the left, if you can see the arrow. So the EPA, when it comes to its conclusions, the vast majority, approximately 3/4 of the research that it relies on, come from the industry itself. Whereas other groups, such as the IARC in the state of California, relied more on publication independent of industry. And as I showed you earlier, the outcomes are very different and have implications for our own health and well-being. And I thought I'd share this with you too. And one of the problems, as you know, within the EPA is there's a lot of cross-fertilization, we could say, between those individuals who work at Monsanto will get jobs in the EPA, et cetera, and within EPA. And so it's been the culture, unfortunately, that's had a lot of adverse consequences for us as far as our food system and our health. And hopefully we can get this to change in the future. We also, as a result of this kind of relationship, see different acceptable limits. So Europe, the acceptable intake for glyphosate is only 0.3 milligrams per kilogram per day. And in the US, it's been listed about 6 times higher, even though physiologically we're not different. So it's a curious phenomenon. Consequences of a lot of this are lawsuits. This was a big one in 2017. This man sued Monsanto for his cancer, and he was awarded $289 million. And 2 years later, Monsanto was this time ordered to pay $2 billion as part of compensatory damages as a result of also a cancer suit. One of the reasons that this compensatory damage was so high is because during the discovery phases of these trials, what emerged from those trials is what's now been called the Monsanto papers. And these were internal documents from the company and from the industry that showed that a lot of what I'm sharing with you now has been known within the company for many, many years, but this had not been disclosed out to the public. And there was also information how the industry had manipulated the science that was presented within the public literature, such as PubMed. And there have been some papers published on this since then. So this is one of them, the Monsanto papers, Poisoning the Scientific Well, and just showing how these documents gave insight into how an industry can have such an adverse effect on the public health by promoting a certain agenda, contrary to public health, but more for their bottom line. The US Congress put out this is their Science, Space, and Technology Committee, put out this document, Spinning Science and Silencing Scientists. And I actually contributed to this document and it was published last year. And it's online if you would like to read it. What does NIH have to say about this phenomenon? So this is Dr. Linda Berman. She was the director of NIEHS up through July of this year, just stepped down. And she was part of a publication that appeared in PLOS ONE Biology, Regulating Toxic Chemicals for Public and Environmental Health. And I was so pleased to see this document because we hadn't heard from NIEHS prior to this on these compounds, even though the evidence had been accumulating so long. But she went on the record to state, and you can see some of the text. So she advocates an overall reduction in the use of agricultural pesticides due to concerns for human health. And she also acknowledged that the regulations from the EPA and the industry have not kept up with the reality of the literature. So she made reference to this human health, concerns for human health. What's an example of a concern for human health, specifically for glyphosate? Well, this morning we were speaking about NAFLD with Dr. Roger Newton and Mrs. Ruth Westreich. And this is an area of research that we decided to focus on for our own next phase of glyphosate research. When we were writing the first paper that we put in JAMA, as I was going through the literature, I kept coming across animal feeding studies. These were with rats and mice, and they were fed glyphosate, pure glyphosate, or exposed to Roundup at very low levels within their food and water. And it was a very consistent outcome, and the outcome was kidney and liver toxicity. And the liver toxicity looked so much like human non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which I'm going to show you has been an epidemic in the US over the last decade and a half. And the question is, why is that? So this is what I'm referencing, these 8 peer-reviewed animal feeding studies that had such consistent outcomes. And they're here as a reference for you, that you have copies of all these documents on my slides. And this is an example one, also coming out of the King's College group in London. They did a multi-omics analysis in the rat feeding study and documented multiple levels of damage to the liver. NAFLD has been epidemic here in the US. These are the rates going up to 2017 at least. And yes, it's associated with obesity, but obesity isn't believed to be the causal agent, but there's a correlation. And vast increase in hospital admissions in the US. So based on those animal feeding studies, our group at UCSD decided we need to look at this. Is there actually a signal here for human beings? If the animal feeding studies are suggesting there's a link there, that a disease in the animals that looks like human NAFLD, how can we go after that? So I did what our group did, what we did last time. We knocked on the door of a colleague at UC San Diego, and this was Dr. Rohit Lumba. And he runs the NAFLD study at UCSD. He runs multi-centered studies for NAFLD across the United States. And I asked him, too, do you know about Roundup and glyphosate? And he didn't. And so we talked about some of these animal feeding studies and the target toxic effects on the liver. And he wasn't aware of it, and he found it surprising. So he also gave us access to his freezer, where he had urine and blood samples from very well characterized patients from his clinical trials. And we wanted to do it this way because we needed to have a confirmation of the diagnosis of NAFLD number 1 and the severity of disease. And part of his clinical trials, they even do biopsies of the liver itself to document the pathology. So it gave us a very well-characterized patient group. So we published this back in May of this year in Clinical Gastroenterology and Hepatology. And essentially, we're able to document a relationship between higher glyphosate exposure in these patients and worse disease. And we characterize them of having more of the definitive disease, which is called NASH, versus not NASH. And this particular slide shows some of the data on this grouping. So for example, glyphosate levels in those patients who had NASH, which is this bar, they weren't statistically significant for the glyphosate, but they were higher for the AMPA. And then this glyphosate residue was particularly significantly higher. Glyphosate residue is it's a calculation we did based on recommendations for the WHO. And it's a formula that you create by glyphosate and the AMP levels, and it helps get a better sense of dietary exposure. Yeah. And the higher dietary exposure, then the more you see the urinary excretion. We also looked at different degrees of severity of fibrosis, and those who had more advanced fibrosis here had higher glyphosate residue levels, higher AMPA levels, and higher glyphosate. So these findings were very confirmatory for the animal studies, which is what we were trying to get at. Again, I'm pleased about the press coverage because it shows that our findings are reaching out to the general public, which they were. And some of the press coverage we got came from Bayer itself. And it wasn't, well, what did they say? Bayer said they got a boost from the EPA that basically assuring that all these products are very safe, including for the human liver function itself. As I mentioned, I'm pleased when we get coverage because that means it's getting out to the general population. And I get a lot of emails after these studies when people who have had different liver diseases, NAFLD, for example, and they don't know why they have it, and they're going on certain drug therapies. And we can then begin to provide some direction for what they could do to start limiting their levels. And Joe, it reminds me of what you were just saying near the end of your presentation. It has to get out to the general public because often the researchers don't know. This Dr. Lumba, he didn't know about this at all, but from our research so far in the animal studies, it seems to be worth knowing. And one of the letters was this physician here that I'm sharing you the text of an email. He's a physician in Salinas, California, which is Central Valley, California, where so many crops are grown in the US. And he noted in his emails that he's been observing the increase of fatty liver disease in the young kids in his clinic over the last decade or more. And yes, it's been associated with obesity, but he hadn't understood the cause. And as a result of our study, he's thinking that this might be a linkage. So we've been following up, and we've been slowly designing a study, and we're going to do a study that I want to give a shout out to Mrs. Ruth Westreich. The Westreich Foundation has provided funding, and we're going to characterize the young kids in his clinic and do kind of a deep dive like we did on the liver study, and we're going to examine, is there a linkage between all the Roundup and glyphosate and other chemicals they're being exposed to in their environment, being surrounded by this agricultural area. So thank you, Ruth, for that. What can we do to limit our exposures? A couple of things. One, of course, is organic diets, which I know it isn't perfect. It depends on the diets you can find in the food, but it's much better. The University of California, which we have 10 campuses. San Diego is the most southern one, of course. Just banned the use of Roundup. This was from the president several months ago. We were pleased to see that. My wife and I, Tiffany Barsotti, live in Encinitas, California, just north of here, and Encinitas has banned it, as well as a couple of other coastal groups. So there's more awareness, which is good. There's going to be less and less of this, certainly in our immediate environments. And I think we're seeing less of it used also agriculturally as the organic movement has picked up steam. There are studies out there showing, so we'll take a group of people and look at their glyphosate excretion and then put them on an organic diet. And within several days, the glyphosate disappears from the urine, documenting their exposures going down very low. But then the question is, how do we get it out of the body and the organ and cells? And of course, that's these non-toxic diets from Dr. Pizzorno's book. We need to learn about how to do that. What about other observations relevant to nutrition? I mentioned earlier, glyphosate has an adverse effect on the microbiome through this shikimite pathway. Glyphosate was patented actually as an antibiotic back in the 70s. And unfortunately, there are a number of studies, here's one of them, showing that glyphosate does have an adverse effect on some of the beneficial bacteria in our gut, creating what's generally called a dysbiosis, but some of the gut microbiome researchers don't like that term. But this has been shown again and again. And for your reference, here are some of the studies listed showing, these are generally animal feeding studies, but there is one or two human studies, adverse effects on the gut population. There's hope, though, right? There's so many great movements going on today. Soil restoration. This is the book that I just finished reading, Kiss the Ground, and it was so inspiring for me to read that and see what people are doing around the country and beyond to help restore agriculture, to bring it back to providing us really healthy food, and not only for ourselves, but the environment too, and soil restoration. The X Prize Foundation, you've probably heard, they provide prizes every year for diverse areas, and they are just developing one called Back to the Earth. It's to focus on food and agriculture. So this is going to help raise awareness too. They're going to give a prize, the best things we can do to get agriculture restored and our soil health back to where it should be, to be able to provide us with nutritious crops. Those of you who might not know about the Odell Institute, if you want to learn more about organic farming, it's an amazing place. It's been there also for several decades. And they've done several head-to-head studies looking at conventional agriculture using things like Roundup and GM crops versus organic. And they've showed definitively year after year you can grow as much or more crop using the organic system. And of course, the soil is much healthier and it's healthier for us as well. I'd like to provide some acknowledgments to the Westreich Foundation. Thank you, Ruth. Ruth was the first one to come forward and fund the research I've been sharing with you. I was not able to get money from the National Institutes of Health for this work. And also the Carolyn McKissick Young Foundation and the Solomon Dukeman Fund at the New York Community Trust. Thank you.